Hello, and welcome to another episode of Trip the Beltway Fantastic. It's been a tremendously brutal week in the Middle East. The war in Gaza continues apace with no ceasefire in sight. Meanwhile, thousands of Lebanese citizens have been injured and at least 32 killed as of this recording on Thursday after pagers and other electronic devices connected to Hezbollah members exploded on Tuesday and Wednesday across the country. It is still not clear how many civilians and bystanders were among those killed and injured. According to the New York Times, 12 current and former defense and intelligence officials who were briefed on the attack say the Israelis were behind it, describing the operation as complex and long in the making. While vocal supporters of Israel are calling the Trojan Horse attack impressive and targeted, others say it was sophisticated booby-trapping, which is not only illegal under international law, but should be considered terrorism. Meanwhile, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia said this week that the kingdom would not normalize relations with Israel until the Palestinians have their own state, joining Oman in throwing cold water on President Biden's grand bargain for the Abraham Accords. And in Iraq, a new deal to bring U.S. troops home for good is running into headlines that ISIS is enjoying a potential resurgence in the region, possibly due to the war in Gaza and upheaval in the region overall. So I'd like to welcome my colleague, Adam Weinstein, to talk about all of this and more today. Aside from being a very astute analyst of Middle East geopolitics with a particular expertise in Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Adam is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, having served in a U.S. Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company in the Afghanistan War in 2012. Thank you, Adam, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I guess the first question is, what do you think of what we've seen in Lebanon this week? How do you think this will change the landscape of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict? Is it a precursor to a larger attack by Israel, a full-blown war? Or is it a way to destabilize the militant group so that it retreats from the border and packs it in until the next blow up?
Well, it's hard to say. I did read that the pagers were compromised, and that a couple Hezbollah members were suspicious of them, and therefore it forced Israel's hand to basically detonate the plan earlier, or implement the plan earlier. On the one hand, you might think, okay, well, it's a great tactic to take out some of Hezbollah's rank and file right before an invasion in the north. Although if it's true that this plan came prematurely, then perhaps it's not connected to that. You could also argue that, hey, this makes the rank and file of Hezbollah scared for their lives in a very personal way. The unpredictability, the idea that it's not just if you're in the south along Israel's border, but anywhere you are in Lebanon, you're not safe. And I think that can really erode the esprit de corps and the will to fight for any group, whether it's a country's military or a militant group. So it's really hard to say. I mean, if you listen to the rhetoric coming out of the Israeli government, they do want to open a front with Lebanon. And I think they've wanted to do that for a while. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that you've seen a less kinetic environment in Gaza. I think they're trying to focus to the north. How Hezbollah will respond, I don't know. I think it should show them how vulnerable they are to Israeli infiltration.
Yeah, and I think for the benefit of the listeners and viewers, I think a misnomer, given the complexity of the situation, of the history there, it's worth noting that Hezbollah is not just a militant group, but also a key part of Lebanese government. It's part of a coalition government. So when, and maybe you could shed some light on this, when we hear that pagers that were connected to Hezbollah fighters had gone off, had been detonated, and we're reading more about where these pagers were manufactured. Apparently, they were manufactured in Israeli shell companies over time and delivered there starting in 2022, there meaning Lebanon. But when we hear that they're connected to fighters, can we assume that these pagers could have been used by people who are not part of the militant Hezbollah arm? Or could you just maybe shed a little light on the role that Hezbollah writ large plays in Lebanon and its government and politics?
Well, like most militant groups, there's a political wing and a militant wing, and so it's conceivable that some of these pagers were used by people who aren't part of the militant wing of Hezbollah. Although, you might argue what's the difference. But in terms of the role that Hezbollah plays in Lebanon, I mean, it is a political force. It's just a fact. And in terms of its militant faction, it has more power than the Lebanese army does. And it enjoys some support. I mean, there are plenty of Lebanese critics of Hezbollah as well, but it enjoys some support, and not just among the Shia population, but even outside of the Shia population, among some of the Christians and so forth. And plenty of people hate Hezbollah too, but it's not a group that doesn't have support. Let's just put it that way. So. In terms of whether civilians were killed, I'm sure there was some collateral damage. In terms of whether it abides by the laws of war, I mean, I think an argument could be made that it accounts for booby trapping. I think what a more important question right now is, what should Israel do now? I mean, it's already happened, and in some sense, it's allowed Israel to restore its prestige, as Israel had this reputation prior to October 7th that it could pull off these kinds of stunts. And this was its deterrent. You didn't want to mess with Israel because Israel had a very sophisticated ability to engage in espionage and sabotage and things like that. And October 7th, put some cold water on that. But in some sense, with the assassination of Hania in Tehran and the blowing up of the Hezbollah pagers, Israel has restored its deterrence a little bit. It's restored its prestige. And if I was advising Israelis right now, I'd say, okay, go for a diplomatic solution now. You've proven that you can hit them where it hurts. Don't keep escalating. You've made your point. Now's the time to stop. What I worry about is that they're not going to do that. This is going to make them even more reckless. They're going to take these victories and they're going to say, well, let's keep going. And at some point, their luck is going to run out, and it's going to escalate in a way that's extremely destabilizing, is going to kill a whole bunch of Israelis, and is actually going to risk bringing the U.S. deeper into this war as well.
Do we often, as media consumers and people outside of, what I would call our media bubble, in which we are watching these foreign policy stories every single day at a granular level, outside that bubble, is there a risk of conflating what happened on October 7th with the ongoing conflict between Hezbollah and Israel over those southern Lebanese territories that have been in dispute for decades? I'm on Twitter all the time, and I almost get the sense that people say, well, if Hezbollah didn't cause October 7th, none of this would be happening to their people right now. Must we remind people that there are two different conflicts here, even though Hezbollah might support Hamas in spirit and in solidarity for the Palestinian movement. They were not behind the October 7th attacks, and that this conflict with Israel is ongoing. And I would say what happened in the last 2 days, in which thousands of people have been injured, many with probably irreparable damage to their faces, maybe not proportionate to what has been happening for the last months in terms of these, rocket exchanges, missile exchanges. Can you lend some context to that? Like, what are we looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, Hezbollah is not responsible for October 7th. Hamas is responsible for October 7th. Now, and if anything, October 7th was a big liability for Hezbollah, and I'm not sure they were all that happy about it. But
Right.
the similarities between the commonalities between Hezbollah and Hamas, are limited to their relationship with Iran and the fact that they have a common enemy in Israel. Other
Correct.
than that, they're quite different groups. Hamas has its roots in the Muslim Brotherhood and in Palestinian resistance, and Hezbollah is a Shia group from Lebanon that has its roots in the Iranian Revolution and the idea of political Shiism and resistance. And so they're very different, and there's not that much in common between them except for the common enemy in Israel. And there's a long history between Israel and Lebanon, and of course, Israel occupied Lebanon. There's territories that are disputed. Israel has there's the Sabra Shatila massacre and so forth. Yep. And of course, Hezbollah has done plenty of bad things to Israel and has essentially made the north of Israel uninhabitable, including territories that are undisputed parts of Israel. So, I mean, there's a lot of bad blood between Hezbollah and Israel, and they have reasons to fight that go far beyond October 7th. October 7th is merely the trigger. And a war between Hezbollah and Israel would be far more destructive than what we've seen even between Gaza and Israel, because Hezbollah has far more capacity to inflict harm on Israel than Hamas does. And so, yeah, it should be avoided at all costs. And, the irony here is that Israel's past bombardments of Lebanon and Beirut have actually made even liberal Lebanese people who would not naturally be inclined to support Hezbollah, it has sometimes made them supportive of Hezbollah, or at least not as critical as they might otherwise be, because there's this sort of a rally around the flag effect. And in this case, sometimes it's the Hezbollah flag, because, well, at least Hezbollah is resisting Israel. And when Israel bombs civilian targets or levels, South Beirut, I think it increases sympathy for groups like Hezbollah in a way that's counterproductive for Israel.
I'm going to ask you a question because, I've seen it posed on social media, and I've asked it myself and in internal conversations with others. If say, the Houthis attacked our naval base and manufacturing facilities in Newport News, Virginia, because of the ongoing conflict that the United States is in militarily with the Houthis in the Red Sea right now. And this was an operation that they pursued in terms of finding a way to put explosives in the cell phones of our sailors in Newport News, Virginia. And they all went off simultaneously, injuring thousands of sailors, but also bystanders, family members who might be holding those phones or nearby. Wouldn't we call that a terrorist attack? Wouldn't we respond much differently than what we're seeing? At what point should there be condemnation for this kind of action? In that, as you noted, was likely against the Geneva Conventions, this booby-trapping. In any other case, might we call that terrorism, and should it be condemned so that we don't give the idea or the impression or signal to other entities, adversaries and otherwise, that this is a condonable way of war?
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk of normalizing this kind of attack because obviously it can be used against us, or it can be used against anyone, really. I mean, now, perhaps luckily most of our adversaries probably don't have the ability to stage this kind of attack, but if they did, maybe they would. And so now that norm has been undone, essentially. And there's no going back once it's been undone. The same way, the Assad regime used barrel bombs, and now that norm is undone. I mean, every time this happens, and of course we condemned that, some proponents of this kind of attack would say, well, at the end of the day, it mostly killed Hezbollah militants, and so what's wrong with it? And I guess, the answer to that might be, well, that's pure luck. You could have imagined a scenario where a little kid is next to their father.
Which happened.
Yeah. And there were children who were killed. So it did happen, and it could have happened at a greater scale. And do we really want to undo this norm? I mean, Israel is a democracy. Israel is part of the international community, and perhaps Israel should hold itself to a higher standard than a terrorist group. I mean, if Israel wants to be treated differently than terrorist groups, it needs to behave differently than terrorist groups. And so I think there is a risk of that norm being undone. I think in the back of our minds, we always have to remember that groups like Hezbollah and groups like Hamas could probably bring a lot more prosperity to the Palestinian Lebanese people if they even accepted the idea of a two-state solution in principle. They don't even have to say what the borders would be. All they have to say is, in principle, we agree to the idea of a two-state solution, and a lot of progress could be made. So I think we always have to keep that in the back of our minds, that Hezbollah and Hamas have agency to de-escalate too. But at the end of the day, we treat Hezbollah and Hamas as terrorist groups, and we treat Israel as a legitimate state. And so Israel has to behave like a legitimate state, and that, if it wants to be treated like a legitimate state.
We're coming up on October 7th, or the anniversary of the massacre that set all of this off. I mean, in your mind, what should we be thinking about as we recognize or observe that anniversary? It seems to me we're no closer to a ceasefire or finding any common ground to ending the conflict, staving off the starvation of the people in Gaza. If anything, it seems to be getting worse. You have what's going on in Lebanon. The violence has increased in the West Bank. How do you think we should be observing this day? I mean, we're obviously at a distance. I'm in Washington, D.C. You're in New York. But like I said, very keen observers of what's happened over the last year.
I mean, I think the best way to honor the victims on both sides is to come to some sort of diplomatic solution and to be realistic. Unfortunately, we know what's going to happen is people are going to divide along tribal lines, and people are going to say, and I mean that tribal in the political sense, not the literal sense, but people are going to say, well, none of this would have happened if Hamas hadn't engaged in terrorism on October 7th. And other people are going to say none of this happened if Israel hadn't cut off Gaza from the world. And no matter what happened in October 7th, it doesn't justify Israel's response. And people who support Israel blindly are going to say, well, sure, but how else can you fight Hamas? And so people are going to put on both sides, they're going to put up their blinders, and they're going to engage in sort of zero-sum talk, and it's going to be absolutely useless. Here's the reality. Israel is not going anywhere. Hamas is not going anywhere. The Palestinians aren't going anywhere. Hezbollah is not going anywhere. So given those realities, the only real solution is de-escalation. There's not going to be total victory for anyone. So the best thing that can be done is to come to some kind of cessation of these hostilities. And fine, let the historians work it out later over who was more responsible for what. But it's not worth continuing to lose human life over.
So let's shift over to Iraq, because I know this is something that you've written about with your colleague, Stephen Simon, in terms of the eventual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq and Syria. We have 2,500 troops about in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and I think some 900 in Syria. Can you talk a little bit about the recent news that there might be a deal on the table to finally get those troops home, a deal between the United States and Iraq by 2026, and why you think it's important that those troops come home? And do you have confidence that the United States will follow through with such a withdrawal?
Well, it's important that troops come home because we're not this is a bit simplistic, but we shouldn't be in the business of deploying troops permanently to countries abroad. Now, the example that proponents of these permanent deployments always give are, well, we have troops in South Korea, we have troops in Okinawa, we have troops in Germany, we have troops in Italy. Okay, well, those troops don't come under mortar attack, every month. And if they did, perhaps we shouldn't have troops there. And those troops exist at the invitation of those countries. And there's even questions about what role those troops play. But But the point is that the situation that those troops exist in is much different than troops who were deployed to Afghanistan or troops who were deployed to Iraq. And there's actually much stronger arguments for having U.S. troops in East Asia versus having U.S. troops permanently deployed in all Anbar in Iraq. We have to have more imagination of a country for how to secure our national interest rather than just keeping U.S. troops deployed permanently. So that's why it's important. What critics of the withdrawal will always say is, okay, well, it increases the risk of a group like ISIS reconstituting. And that's absolutely true. But if we're not willing to accept any risk, then the only alternative is to remain deployed indefinitely. And there's risks to that. I mean, the presence of U.S. troops in Syria and their partnership with the SDF makes our relationship with Turkey absolutely dysfunctional.
Right.
And our relationship with Turkey will remain dysfunctional so long as U.S. troops are deployed in Syria. Now, Turkey might want U.S. troops to exist in Iraq because they think U.S. troops are a source of stability there. But we're not accountable to what Turkey wants. We're accountable to what are in our national interests. And the reality is that having U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria increases risks of tensions between the U.S. and Iran, between the U.S. and Turkey, and increased risks to the lives of U.S. troops. And is there some gain? Sure. We have a greater guarantee that ISIS will not reemerge. We have a greater guarantee that ISIS
I looked at my phone. I'm like, is that me?
No, that's me. Unfortunately, I should have put it on airplane.
Okay.
It connects to my laptop. But we have a greater guarantee that ISIS won't reemerge. But I don't think it's worth the cost of remaining deployed indefinitely. And there's ways to mitigate that risk. The plan that I saw isn't to have every single last advisor come home. It's to have the vast majority of U.S. troops come home, and there will still be some advisory capacity. And the Iraqi security apparatus will have to find its own way to contain ISIS. And I think, unlike 2013, 2014, they'll be highly motivated to do so.
And we have tens of thousands of troops in the Middle East today, many of them based at these permanent bases in places like Kuwait. If we needed to activate to fight ISIS, it's not as though we all have to do it by scratch and start mobilizing here in the United States and flying people over there. I mean, we do have a pretty firm footprint already in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's true. And we've seen that in our ability to respond to the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. And also we had this mass naval deployment essentially to deter Iran from responding to Israel's assassination of Hania in Tehran. So we've seen our ability. We have these naval assets. We have these QRFs essentially. So we're able to respond. And I think that's a very good point. And look, people said the same thing when we were through from Afghanistan, that it was going to be a boon for ISK. And in reality, there was a immediate spike in ISK attacks following the withdrawal because there was chaos. But then over time, ISK attacks went way down. And the Afghan Taliban have found their own way of containing ISK. And I think the Iraqi security forces are even more motivated to do it. In 2013 and 2014, it was a very different time in Iraq, and I think the Sunni communities where ISIS was able to take territory, such as in Mosul and Fallujah and Ramadi, they didn't know what they were getting themselves into. I think now they do, and I think there's no Iraqi city or town that wants to fall back under ISIS, and I think there's going to be a real motivating factor there to prevent any ISIS reemergence. But so long as U.S. troops are doing the work for them, they're not going to do it. These Iran-aligned militias have essentially had a free pass to engage in their various business activities and money laundering and attacking U.S. troops because they don't have to focus on ISIS because the U.S. troops are doing it for them. If there are no U.S. troops, all of a sudden those Iran-aligned militias might have more motivation to deal with ISIS rather than to be lobbing mortars at U.S. troops.
That's a good point. And I'm wondering, and this might be a provocative question, but on the issue of the Houthis in the Red Sea, I had read somewhere recently, and I forgive me, I can't remember, I can't pinpoint where I read it, but the Gulf states were sort of complaining that the U.S. conflict with the Houthis in the Red Sea over their attacks on shipping, and then our retaliation, or at least the attempt to shut them down by bombing their facilities in Yemen, was disruptive. And I'm thinking, well, why can't we just pack up and leave and let them take care of the situation in their own backyard? I mean, can you talk a little bit about, do we need to continue to commit our naval resources to fighting the Houthis in the Red Sea, or is it time, like battling ISIS in Iraq and Syria, to let those countries kind of do their own thing to maintain the security of shipping there?
Well, unfortunately, the Gulf countries don't have the naval capacity to do it, even if they wanted to do it. What I'd say to the Gulf countries is the Saudi campaign against against Yemen has been incredibly destabilizing and disruptive, and has helped bring us to this moment. I think there's an incentive to keep shipping lanes open and not allow any group to essentially weaponize piracy. But on the other hand, we have to recognize, and President Biden himself said this, it's not working. So
Right.
the only way to actually open the shipping lanes is really to bring the Houthis to the negotiating table, which of course is going to be difficult because, one, they might have some ideological. They state that what they want is a ceasefire in Gaza,
Right.
and I believe that they have some commitment to that. They also have an incentive to distract their own population from its economic problems by showing a kind of victory in the Red Sea, and they're also sending a clear message to the world and to their enemies that, hey, this is what we're capable of. We really can close down the Red Sea. We have this ability now. You have to take us seriously. And I think that message has been delivered, and we should let them know that message has been delivered. But now's the time to come to the negotiating table and bring an end to this madness. And that's the only way it's going to end. Because the reality is that the cost for the Houthis to continue this campaign is much lower than the cost to the small international coalition that's fighting them. It doesn't cost them that much. All they have to do is target a couple ships a month, and they can essentially keep the entire Red Sea closed for business. But it costs a whole lot to have all these naval assets deployed, and it's not working.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't, even if we left and we said, let's just, in an alternate universe, the Gulf countries had the ability to handle this in terms of, because they had this equal naval assets, it wouldn't work for them either, because it's not that kind of conflict. It's the definition of irregular warfare.
Are you surprised how resilient the Houthis have been? I mean, this has been going on for months. We're expending like billions of dollars at this point with the missile defense operations that we've been engaging, as well as the airstrikes against their assets in Yemen itself. And they keep popping up and they keep striking out against these ships and sinking them and starting oil fires and whatnot. Are they just being supplied by Iran like continuously, or do they have their own capabilities and resources that seem to be endless? I mean, are you surprised that the United States hasn't managed to militarily shut them down yet?
Well, to give some praise to the United States, I think the United States also observes some limits and some boundaries in how much
Yeah,
harm they're willing to bring to Yemen. The U.S. could escalate the campaign against
that's
the
a good
Houthis,
point.
and maybe it would have some effect. But I think rightfully so, for both strategic and moral reasons, the Biden administration has chosen not to, escalate it beyond the point of no return. On the other hand, it's just cheap for the Houthis to do this. They have an endless supply of young men who are willing to die for this cause. And it just doesn't take that much all they need is some cheap drones and some very unsophisticated speedboats, and they're able to create chaos.
Yeah.
They don't need aircraft carriers. And so it just doesn't cost that much for them to keep this going indefinitely. And so it's not surprising. And they've shown incredible resilience in their conflict with Saudi Arabia. So they've shown that they won't roll over. And I think given that reality, we have to think about different approaches.
Yeah. And let's just end the show on a more positive note for the United States. I know we spend a lot of time on the show criticizing U.S. foreign policy and military policy, but I think you're absolutely correct. I think we've made an assessment that we can expend these expensive missile defense systems. We can keep the deployments out there. Unfortunately, we're putting our sailors in harm's way, but we can do that without bringing pain to the civilian population of Yemen, which, as you know, has been under unbelievable distress since that war began in 2014. And I don't think the Israelis would take the same approach. I think their approach would be that it's like carpet bomb Yemen and teach them a lesson and hope that would put the end to it. So I am glad that we have taken the approach of just kind of wasting our weapon stockpiles for the last several months. But I also agree with you that at this point, maybe a recalibration is in order in terms of what our forward strategy should be with the Houthis if it's not working. Before we go, can you just tell me, I want people to download or at least take a look online at your paper and Stephen's paper. Can you remind us what the name of the paper is and where they can find it?
Yeah, let me name myself. I forget what we named it.
But I mean, just to remind folks that it is about, it is a plan for withdrawing our U.S. troops from Syria and Iraq.
But I just want to say one, before I share that, I want to say one reaction to what you said, which is that I know there are folks who truly believe that the projection of American power and not showing weakness in the face of groups like the Houthis is extremely important. Sometimes I think that's overemphasized because, I believe in a more restraint-oriented foreign policy. But what I'd say to them is, even if you believe that maintaining American power projection and American strength is the most important aspect of U.S. foreign policy, it still makes sense to go to the negotiating table with the Houthis, because the Houthis are embarrassing us. The fact that we have all of these naval assets deployed and we're still not able to open up the shipping lanes is an embarrassment. And we should bring an end to that embarrassment as quickly as possible. So it'd actually be a face-saving mechanism to come to some sort of agreement with the Houthis rather than continue a strategy that isn't working. For some reason, I don't know if I have an internet issue, but it's not loading. But the name of the paper is "You Can Go Home Again," which is obviously a literary reference. But you can find it on the Quincy Institute website under reports, or if you were to just Google Adam Weinstein and Stephen Simon, "You Can Go Home Again, Iraq," something like that, some variation of those words, it would come up immediately. And it's a paper that details why we should withdraw and how we should withdraw. And by the way, the piece that was recently published in the Washington Post by Charles Lister and General Votel, the recommendations they had for how to protect our interests after a withdrawal were the same recommendations that we published like a year and a half ago.
A year and a half ago, yeah.
So
we're copycatting, really.
Yeah, well, I don't know if they did it intentionally or not, but the point is that we were there first a year and a half ago, and I think it's interesting that four people who think very differently actually came up at least with the same ideas for how to protect our interests when after we withdraw. The difference being that we, I think, make a strategic case for why we should withdraw. And that's what's most important, is to have that strategic clarity that withdrawing is the right decision. And by the way, here's how you can protect our interests after we leave. And yeah, we were there first, not to brag, but we were there first at a time when nobody was saying that we should withdraw. And I think as the withdrawal comes closer, the same thing that happened with the Afghanistan withdrawal will happen, where everyone and their cousin will come out and say, we knew this was the right decision. But the reality is nobody said that at the time. And Quincy Institute really was kind of out there alone saying there has to be a better way. And that paper outlines what that better way is.
Well, I'm just so grateful that you are on our team and out there literally putting your neck out there and in sort of the wilderness to vocalize these important proposals and points of view. And I'm glad that the foreign policy establishment is coming around to that. And I will also link it in the show notes of this episode as well, so people can take a look. So thank you so much, Adam, for joining us on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic, and I hope you'll come on again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I hope you have me again.
Thank